I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Welcome to our GM Tools pacing encounters, both in and out of game. So we're going to cover both of those in one episode that we ourselves will pace.
Yes.
We've already had episodes that are kind of about like dramatic session pacing, but encounter pacing is a little bit different, and that's also partially because of the fact that it is a construct that changes not only during each session, but also in-game for how long a group goes before they rest, especially before they rest for the night.
Yes.
So many other similar RPGs to Pathfinder 2, such as Pathfinder 1 or most editions of D&D, some of the earliest didn't do this, but a lot of them lay out like, we kind of think you're going to have like 8 encounters in a day or some number that is way higher than almost anyone usually faces, and that then like the entire game's expectations are balanced around. So if you have fewer encounters, a lot of things work differently, and then you always usually have fewer encounters. Pathfinder 2 does not list an expected number of counters that you would have during an adventuring day, because it's so variable that it's kind of like a computer's progress bar that is there to like make you think that it's that percentage down because we like seeing a progress bar. But when you have a GM rather than a computer who's actually trying to pull everything together, then the fact that it's misleading can wind up really harming the GM's ability to prepare and run sessions.
Well, one of the main things that determines the pacing of a game is going to be the incentives. There's two main types of incentives that factor into this. There's the mechanical incentives. What kind of benefits do your PCs get for resting or for taking more time and doing other things like that? And then there's also the story incentives. Is there, some benefit from moving quickly or some consequence from moving slowly?
That's right. Generally, even in these games that say, run 8 encounters per day, unless you have a very ticking time clock, there's nothing to stop people from just even stopping after one encounter other than we're out here, so we might as well do a little more and we're doing fine.
Yeah. In sort of a classic dungeon setup, there is that sense of hey, what happens if the PCs decided, say, let's go into one room, fight the things in that room, and then rest. When you're running games, it's good to make sure that the situation responds dynamically to the PCs. So if the PCs come in and they're like, oh, we're going to attack this one room and then we're going to leave, that, people don't just sit in their same rooms and say, yes, I'm going to sit here and wait for the PCs to come back.
When you say the classic dungeon, that's the slightly later than classic dungeon that makes sense. The classic dungeon makes no sense and has ecologically different creatures with very little explanation that aren't related to each other. In like the next room is this thing and it doesn't care about anything else. And so then sometimes that already has its own built-in explanation of why it doesn't add to encounters or
well, not everything's going to naturally add. You're going to have, in an interesting and vibrant dungeon environment, whether it's like a building or underground, you're going to have some degree of people who all work well together and people who may not work so well together, and people who are more proactive about seeking what's going on, and people who are more afraid or more like, my minions will take care of this. But
modern dungeons have explanations like that.
Yeah. But generally, one of those main incentives is going to be that the clock is going to advance on what other folks are doing if the PCs are really dithering and taking their time. You might see some of those weaker encounters gathering up into stronger encounters. You may see the opponents going out to try to find the PCs while they're resting or other things like that. So that there is a sense that, and once you've done that for your players, if they were the type who are like, oh, let's just do this one thing and go rest, then they can realize, like, there's an opportunity cost to taking a long time. Or if they're like, oh, our goal is to go here because we want to take the magic sword of awesome. Maybe if they spend enough time going back and forth to the dungeon, the NPCs are like, they're after the magic sword of awesome. Let's just clear out. Clearly this place has been compromised, and then the PCs have to go somewhere else.
Absolutely. Generally, you're in the best shape when there's some push and pull, and the players, whether they have seen bad consequences from resting too many times, have some impetus to keep going, but not so much that they push themselves until their characters die and that they rest when they're ready, rather than just let that one, the one whiny wizard player who's like, but I just burst out all my meteor swarms against these goblins and now I need to rest.
Yes.
You could call the player whatever you want. I think I've talked about that topic sometimes before, about the player who just throws all their things out and then has to rest. You call that player Jill. It doesn't really matter. I don't know someone named Jill who does things like that.
Oh, November has a good point here.
Kitchev calls the player Jim.
The greatest motivator for players who are dithering. GM randomly rolling dice and looking thoughtful, and are referencing a sometimes non-existent document. Yes. That, stoking paranoia by like, ooh, okay, wait, what might be going on? Random dice rolling is a fun trick. As is, like, another one I enjoy is, like, overly describing things that aren't actually that significant, or, like, putting minis on the map for statues or other things like that, just to...
Yeah. No, I still remember when we were GMing the Boston Lodge, there's one player who metagamed a lot, so you just put down little minis for all these mummified figures that were in a hallway, and he wasted channel energy on it. It was just described as mummified figures in the hallway.
I've also had people shoot a lot of arrows at them and do other things, and then I think it
shoot arrows at statues because you put down a large size mini where the statue was.
Yep.
That looked like a golem. All sorts of interesting things.
Yes.
So I think that honestly that it's sort of metagaming, but it also sort of like maybe they're showing what their characters are really like, and when they see a statue, maybe they should shoot it.
Yeah, and I think that, I don't think it's a problem that they're like, wait, that looks like it could be a thing that attacks. Then you're never actually catching them by surprise either, because their character not like, oh, no, wait, I would have done something, because they knew it was there.
Yep. So, when we're talking about encounter pacing, we said it's good to have a push and pull where they don't feel like they're dead if they rest, and so they can when they need to, but they should feel some motivation to keep going in the day. Question is then, since I already said, well, Pathfinder 2 does not say a listed number of encounters per day, so what even should you be trying to shoot for? And the answer is, look at the descriptions of encounters and building encounters. It's not a number of encounters, it is a dynamic of encounters. So, a trivial threat encounter is so easy, you have essentially no chance of losing, you don't even need to spend resources unless you're very wasteful. If you're Jill, then they work best as warm-ups, palette cleansers, as reminders of how awesome the characters are. They can still be fun to play, so don't ignore them just because they're so easy.
When you're throwing trivial encounters in, they don't really have an appreciable effect on the number of encounters that you can throw into the day, so... put them in exactly as it says there, warm-ups, palette cleansers, or when they feel appropriate. And you don't have to worry about them costing too much.
Now, here's the thing. Low-threat encounters present a veneer of difficulty and typically use some of the party's resources. However, it would be rare or the result of very poor tactics for the entire party to be seriously threatened. What that means is they also usually don't have an effect on the party's daily need to rest. Again, unless you have a Jill player who is like, this looks slightly threatening. Meteor swarm.
Or unless, that particular composition of low-threat encounter is more challenging for the party based on their makeup.
Or if it's rare or the result of very poor tactics. So that rare or result of very poor tactics could happen. But in most cases, it may accelerate the need for a 10-minute rest to get back some hit points, to get back some focus points. But it probably won't accelerate the need for a daily rest very much. Meaning that you could throw... probably a lot of groups, although again if you do enough you'll hit the rare time that something bad happens just by chance. You roll 4 natural 20s or something.
Yeah, and that's a rare chance for them to be seriously threatened. It could
they still
eventually
probably
stack
aren't
up.
gonna lose,
particularly if you have a lot of them in a row with close succession and then you don't have the 10-minute rest in the middle, then you're going to have to start digging deeper into their daily resources.
That's correct.
And the cost is going to go up.
But assuming that they could take a 10-minute rest between them, you could have 30 low threat encounters in a day. That might cause a problem because of the rare chance at bad luck or something like that. It might start digging into resources, but it might actually not. It also depends on your group's composition. If your group is very focused, if your group has a lot of like fighter or rogue, martial classes, or an elemental avatar instead of a spellcaster who can just keep going, then you're even more likely to be able to take that many. Whereas if your group has something like a cleric where it's like, I have a ton of top level healing, and I'm gonna rely on it even in easier encounters because I have like 8.
Yes.
Which 8 is a lot of top level spells. Nobody has 8 except for a cleric. But after 30 fights, if you actually keep using them in the fights, you will run out.
Yeah.
So it depends on your party, but many parties actually probably could make it through dozens of low threat encounters in the same day, assuming, like Linda said, that the pacing is right, that it's not a very bad matchup for them, not weird luck happening.
Yeah. And a lot of what has to do with the pacing too is what the players decide to do as their strategy right up front. You know, if the players know, hey, we're going into this place and there's going to be a lot of encounters up front, then they're going to play in a way where they conserve resources. Whereas if they're like, oh yeah, we're probably not going to have to do other things.
If they're the Jill player, then Jill
yes.
player is just not going to do it.
Yeah, well, generally speaking, they're going to conserve more resources. Whereas if they think, oh yeah, this is the only encounter or whatever, they're more likely to blitz things to get things done sooner, which that can affect the pacing too. You know, if you have something set up where the players think, oh yeah, you know, this is the end of things, and then you throw another encounter at them. Like I just saw a chat about that too, where you know the players are low on resources, and even a trivial encounter could be a jump scare. Like, oh my gosh, there's an encounter, and we really weren't expecting things.
They still probably win because it's trivial, but they might be scared by it, even though they know that the monsters that are in it seem pretty easy.
And having another encounter that's not necessarily that difficult when the players are low on resources is a great way to really hammer home that feeling of what are we going to do to use these things.
So let's move into moderate threat encounters. Well, I'm literally just using the definitions of these from the core rulebook, but these already tell us how to pace encounters. And I noticed that a lot of people were wondering how to pace encounters because it doesn't directly say this. You have to extrapolate it from the lines that are in there, but you can extrapolate directly. So let's do this. Moderate threat encounters are a serious challenge to the characters, though unlikely to overpower them completely. Characters usually need to use sound tactics and manage their resources wisely to come out of a moderate threat encounter ready to continue on and face a harder challenge without resting.
So that means, you know, in a lot of cases after a moderate encounter, the PCs are going to want to rest for 10 minutes.
Yeah, they're going to need a 10-minute rest. Not only that, but it's actually, they might not manage their resources wisely. You don't know your party. They don't even have to be Jill to actually spend a decent number of even some of their daily resources on a moderate threat. So, depending on your group, some groups actually could probably do moderate 10-minute rest, moderate 10-minute rest, moderate 10-minute rest, and keep doing that a lot of times. But depending on your group, you can't necessarily be sure that you can throw a lot of moderate threats during the same day. And in fact, if you were, one question that I answered for DM Layer was asking about this is like, if I'm a publisher and I'm making an adventure, I need to make sure that any group, even the most like daily resource burning style group, can reliably get through everything that's in that in one day, because otherwise it breaks the entire plot if they ever have to rest. What is like the highest amount of things that I could put into it?
And did you say basically all low until the very end?
I said like basically almost any number of lows. Obviously, there's always going to be some chance that they have to rest. And then like one moderate and one severe. Yeah. Most likely. Because even then, it does say if you don't use good tactics and you don't use the resources wisely, or you have bad luck, then you might not be able to take the severe threat without resting. But most groups can, if they get the 10 minutes. So severe encounters are the hardest encounters most groups of characters can consistently defeat. These encounters are most appropriate for important moments in your story, such as confronting a final boss. Bad luck, poor tactics, or a lack of resources due to prior encounters can easily turn a severe threat encounter against the characters, and a wise group keeps the option to disengage open.
So definitely, before throwing a severe encounter at the PCs, particularly when you're looking at the lower level groups who aren't going to have as many resources stocked up, you're going to want to give them a chance to rest up and
you at least probably want them to get 10 minutes.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a full rest, but at least something.
Yes. So in general, assuming that you could just adjust things on the fly, you could also be way less like conservative with like saying, oh, only one moderate and then one severe. That's very conservative. Many groups can actually take more than that in a single day. It depends on their composition. If you're doing it on the fly, you can watch and see what happens. In fact, while severes have a tendency to be last because it's like the final boss, if you start with a severe encounter, you will know how much of the party's resources that takes, which could
Yeah.
be all of them. To be clear, you don't have to be a Jill to be throwing your best stuff at a Severe. It's Severe for a reason. And so, but once you see, if the party having to get lucky, the Barbarian critted early on, they beat the Severe and didn't use that many resources, then they actually could probably take a bunch of harder encounters.
Yeah.
Or they can still take harder encounters or another Severe in that same day.
Yeah, and it's totally fine to shake out that pacing. It can be interesting. It just, the reason that they're suggested for final encounters generally is because then you know the PCs aren't going to have to do something else after that. And because, you know, if you have an encounter early on with the minions and then people are expecting, oh, the boss is going to be so dangerous, and then the boss goes down too quickly, then it can feel anticlimactic.
That's right.
So generally then in that case, you might want to do something where you have a Severe earlier on and there's like a chance to rest, and some other encounters and there's a chance to rest for the night before they go in and do the boss. It's also Severe.
That's right. Narrative-wise, doing the Severe first usually doesn't make any sense. However, mechanically wise and in terms of the biggest danger moment that you can have with that Severe, especially if it's not hugely signposted with like a giant boss door, is just exactly that the group is like, well, we can probably take one more as long as it's not a Severe. Or even, we could probably take one more even if it is a Severe, but they're wrong. And they go in resource-starved into the Severe, which unfortunately the narrative trope of, well, the last thing is the final encounter is the Severe, leads toward that happening a little more often than it would otherwise. So you may have to consider that when you're pacing things.
Yeah, but you can also totally have a Severe first structure where the PCs are going into a situation where then suddenly things become really dangerous. Like they hop through a portal and they appeared in the middle of an active battlefield, or some other thing happened and then it makes them be like, whoa, okay.
Yes. Consider doing on purpose what Linda was forced to do in a PFS scenario where we were supposed to save some particular Pathfinders. They were like, save these researchers who were from our lodge. And we were like, do you have like a writing or something that was written by any of these people ever? Like, yes, here's a note that they sent like a while ago. Okay, that is a scrying object that we can use. We'll need a picture and their name of one of them. And then we scryed on the person we were trying to save and then teleported to the location because we knew where it was.
Yeah.
And we therefore went into the room with the person we were trying to save, which was the final boss.
Yes.
Killed the final boss and then had to escort that person and a bunch of hostages through the entire rest of the adventure backwards.
Yes.
As Linda was running it. Which, you could do that on purpose. Like, you could just have an adventure.
It's like, oh yeah, you know, you need to infiltrate
teleport to this place and get a thing, or like save some hostages, and then escape with the hostages after defeating like the main person who
or like the, or you know, the telling the PCs are in gets sieged, or like some other thing goes terribly wrong and it's difficult, but you manage to fight your way out, and that can really create a sense of urgency right from the beginning.
Exactly. So basically what I'm saying here is you can toggle it yourself if you're a home GM, which this is GM tools, so you probably are. But you can toggle it yourself, pay attention to the party's resources, and if you're the kind of GM who's like, well, I could do that, but I am the uncaring world, and I've decided already what the encounters are going to be, and it is up to them to keep their resources well, then as the uncaring world, you still should keep in mind that depending on your group's composition, moderates are where they might lose. They might be more likely, even without a Jill player, to lose resources that are going to be important for them and that really take out a chunk of their day. And Severe is the one where they almost definitely will lose those resources.
There's another option for Severes too, for Severe placement too, and it reminds me of an encounter that I was just playing in Fire Emblem Three Houses, actually, where you have a situation where something is telegraphed to the PCs that, like, you know, if you push this button and go behind the door, it's really dangerous. So if you activate this ritual, it's going to be dangerous. If you unseal this, like, vat, then something dangerous is going to happen, and then they can choose.
Yes, Linda attacked the Death Knight in Chapter 4, everyone. She did. She killed that
I don't know if anyone here's played Three Houses, but...
Probably, like, half of people played it, and the other half will never play it.
Okay, sure.
That may be an exaggeration.
Probably an exaggeration. I know we have a lot of gamers in chat, but...
Yes.
Yep.
I mean, people are playing it all over time. I saw, like, someone that Twittered and notified me had, like, just beaten it, like, yesterday or the day before. But... Even so, yeah, absolutely. You can have things that are hugely telegraphed.
Yeah, where it's like, oh yeah, you know that like the out here there be dragon and the dragon has a valuable hoard, but are you really gonna go out and fight the dragon? Well, you choose when you're gonna go handle
Yeah,
that.
we did that in Mark's Adventures like
Mhm.
a month ago or so.
Yep.
Absolutely. So when we're talking about in-game pacing for
Mhm.
PF2, that is basically how you figure it out. Trivial
Mhm.
takes almost no resources. I mean, barring bizarre circumstances.
Yeah.
Low might take some resources towards a 10-minute rest. It depends on your characters being uber profligate or uber unlucky,
Mhm.
or you being uber lucky with your D20s.
Mhm.
Moderate probably will take most of the resources towards a 10-minute rest and might take some daily resources away that makes it so you're not ready for the severe. Perhaps if you are unlucky or use bad tactics. And then severe is really going to drain you a lot.
Let's talk a
Most
bit
of the
about
time.
extreme, the very sometimes snack.
Okay, so other than like groups that are very, very synergized at high levels who can just take extremes and be like, that's fine. Extremes generally, you are just giving cruel and unusual punishment to your group, especially if they're not like at full going into it and expected not to do much going out of it.
Yes. These are like your, particularly at higher levels, like your final arc bosses. Your encounters where, they could go up to extreme if the PCs don't prepare, but they have plenty of opportunities to prepare and,
Or
and you're
where they
expected
are
to knock
where
it
they
down.
are extreme, but it's like I'm gonna use all my mega elixirs in this fight.
Yes,
I know it's
you
the
have
last
all the
fight.
resources. They have like a special item that helps them out, or some other thing that helps them take the edge off, so they can still feel like they overcame overwhelming odds, but they did it based on their preparations and what they did in other missions.
Or whatever item is stronger than mega elixirs. Wasn't there an item in like Final Fantasy VIII that made you literally invincible, but it was rarer than mega elixirs for like multiple rounds?
I didn't actually play much of FF8.
I remember using those items on the final boss, so I think they exist.
Mhm.
And it was trivially easy because I had never used any of them up until
Yep.
that. So that is the kind
I
of thing
know
that you would do.
Mark never spends consumables in games, and when he's watching me play, he sometimes is like, you can kind of see him flinch a little bit when I use consumables, and I'm like, this kind isn't going to be valuable again later. And then
I think I should get better at using consumables.
Yeah.
I can use consumables to get restored when you rest because they're kind of not consumable.
Yeah, I'm still careful enough that I never like run into trouble with them, but it's just so funny because
I feel like I'm actually really good at using the consumables that are like Estus Flask style at the right time and not too conservative with those. Whereas I'm terrible at using consumables that are just like, this is gone now.
Yeah, and then you wind up being like, well, I guess I'm gonna sell my stacks of 99 thises because they're not valuable at this point in the game anymore.
Usually I don't, just in case something comes that needs them, but if it is capped at 99, I'll sell down to like 70. I'll sell down to like 70 anytime I'm at 90 or above.
Yes.
Is what I'll usually do because there's a chance that someone will come and be like, well, I need 75 of this item for this rare quest that was later on.
They never do that with the potions, do they?
No, but they could. Or if it's one of the games where you can only heal at like certain save points or something like that, I figure I might be stuck in a long dungeon and need to literally use the potions out of combat to heal, or other things like that.
Nightbeer understands.
Yes.
See, I think I'm a bit of an item hoarder too, just not as much as you are.
Perhaps. But that's also why I like things like making the those Gardens of Power and Treasure Vault, because that's the kind of thing I will use.
Let's see. Zembo says, have you guys ever heard of the 100-round dungeon? Like where the party just loads up 10-minute buffs and rushes through it all?
I have not heard of the 100-round dungeon.
I haven't heard of that specifically.
However, I did create a one-shot for PaizoCon just before PF2 was out, called Fighter Squad versus the Throne of Chaos, where it is a group of fighters who basically beat up increasingly difficult encounters and then get like it's based on like old school arcade beat 'em up games, because after each encounter you get a chicken that heals you up to full, that a random power up that gives like a random feat that or ability that is usually from fighter but sometimes from other martial classes, and then they alternate giving you +1 to all like kind of checks and DCs or +2 and some more hit points, and it's kind of like leveling up. And so in that 4-hour one shot, we essentially did what was the equivalent of leveling up from 1 to 15 ish, and fought 14 encounters, 14 quick encounters, and they eventually managed to defeat the Demon Lord of Chaos, who was actually a Protean, but was known as the Demon Lord of Chaos. I think that none of them fell prey to chaos themselves, because it's possible to happen. So like that's probably similar to that, in that they went through like they started as these level 1 fighters, and by the time they were finished, they defeated a Kekatar Protean.
So your follow up here. I'm too new to know how to balance that. I would say that one thing to pull specifically out of what Mark said there is, if you're going to be throwing a lot of encounters at them, at some point they are even if you're just doing lows, they are gonna take down on resources. And if they don't actually have time to take 10-minute rests, you might consider doing things that have an equivalent effect to a 10-minute rest for your sprint dungeon, like things that heal them up to full or restore other resources every once in a while, like checkpoints, like maybe every 5 encounters or every 3 encounters or whatever, depending upon how difficult you have it. Or you could be a little more flexible and watch when do the PCs really need it. Then they find like the healing fountain that helps them restore their resources.
It's also worth noting that if your meta is 100-round dungeon, and everyone knows that it's a 100-round dungeon, and that means that like when the encounter ends, the next one immediately begins. There's not a few minutes in between like are expected each time. Then the ability to beat encounters low in a row goes up by a ton. And that's assuming your party has casters. And that's because you can put up 10-minute buffs, and Zempel even mentioned this a little bit, and expect to have them last through the entire thing. I mean, definitionally they will. And so you cast the most overpowered 10-minute buffs that you can find. That generally means that you can often treat low threat encounters almost like trivial encounters if you picked overpowered enough 10-minute buffs to put up. It definitely could be worth doing that, since you know it's a 100-round dungeon challenge.
Another thing you can look to do is consider what consumables they have going in. If they have more resources that they can use in different ways on some of those encounters, that can also give them more flexibility to recover with fewer like bespoke things in the middle of the dungeon.
Matt Shazi has an interesting question. How come the Hell Knight Cavalry Troop is level 8, made up of 16 Hell Knights, but a single Hell Knight must be at least beat a level 5 Devil to pass their test? That's because some of the members of those troops are armigers who are hoping to pass their test by working in a Hell Knight Cavalry troop.
And the picture clearly shows fully armored Hell Knights and not armigers. I would say that they probably then the description was Hell Knight Cavalier troop, and it wasn't passed down to the artist. But some of them must be armigers because based on the balance of
some of them are armigers who have gotten a very fancy armiger armor that looks like the Hell Knight armor. Which there have been at least one character, if I remember correctly, in the adventure paths who wound up with that being their story, because they had to be an armiger to be encountered at that stage in time. The art looked like a Hell Knight armor, so it was described that sometimes armigers who are like really kind of tryhards get their not Hell Knight plate to look like kind of like Hell Knight plate, and a good armor smith can tell that it's obvious that it's not, but from a distance it kind of looks like it.
Maybe if you're using that specific art for something, you could say that like maybe part of their intimidation tactic is to make sure you can't tell who are the full Hell Knights and who aren't.
That's
among the group when you're just looking
like
at
the adjutants.
So you don't know who to strike first.
Even so, like there's quite a lot of them for a level 8 troop. And Matt Shazi even said the same thing. Even 11 armigers level 2 would still be more.
Well,
even your 4 level 5 Hell Knights as an encounter would be harder than a level 8 creature.
Yeah.
especially with horses. Horses can add things to the
Yeah,
mix.
maybe the idea is that they don't fight together with perfect efficiency when they're fighting. But then it's like, why do they form that instead of just fighting individually?
Maybe the answer is that there weren't actually supposed to be 16 of them in the cavalry troop because of the fact that even though it probably says that there are, because it's 16 squares, there are horses, and so they're bigger, and so maybe there's supposed to be fewer of them.
Yeah, that could be a reason too.
Actually,
how many squares does it say it takes? Go down.
Yeah, it says it consists of several Hell Knights and a single field Merelictor.
Okay, but this says
it takes up 16 squares.
Yeah, it's 16. Okay, so it does take up 16 squares. Okay, yeah.
It doesn't
so maybe
say it consists of 16 Hell Knights.
Okay, so so maybe it's fewer, and that's part of it.
Maybe it's fewer, but even
that still wouldn't work out mathematically.
It just was 3 Hell Knights and a single field Merelictor to take up the 16 spaces with the 4 horses.
Yeah.
That would still be slightly stronger if they were encountered separately, perhaps. Unless the Hell Knights beat the level 5 devil while being below level 5.
Yes.
By somehow bringing enough consumables to the mix. They would need to have done that, and the field Merelictor would need to be, like, not very strong.
Yes.
And if you can manage all that, then it sort of works. But it is probably true that the, like, a Hell Knight cavalry troop that has lots of Hell Knights maybe should be higher level, and that, like, a, like, more basic cavalry troop is maybe more like an 8th level thing. That's okay. You can always make the, like, experienced Hell Knight cavalry troop that's a stronger version. So, that is in-game pacing. And ask any other questions you have about in-game pacing of encounters. Now, for out-of-game pacing of encounters, obviously, you can refer back to our overall session pacing episode, although not until it's actually up on YouTube. But when it comes to pacing encounters, that's a big part of what your session's pacing is made up of, because encounters take a long time.
Yeah.
Not everyone... I mean, my group was very, very cooperative to get through 14 encounters in 4 hours, while also leveling up. They knew what they were doing. We went quickly. We flipped over to the next flip map and plopped everything down. Most groups would not be able to do that. Encounters really take a significant enough chunk of your session that you should make sure they're important enough to be worth spending that much time for your session.
Yeah, especially if you're, like, drawing out maps and setting things up and you're not doing things theater of the mind. You want to make sure that it's going to have some kind of a lasting impact there.
I want to assure you that that doesn't mean you shouldn't run trivial encounters, because the psychological benefit of running trivial encounters for your group is beneficial enough, even though, yes, it's not a challenge. It doesn't really add much always, but especially if you can find a trivial encounter that tells an interesting part of the story.
Yeah.
Like, this is where the crappy minions were.
Especially also, like, putting
bandits who accidentally attacked the PCs,
and
even though not knowing how strong they are.
Putting the trivial encounter, like, on the same map that you have another thing, so it's not, like, making you have to put out all sorts of other resources and things like that, too.
Like, it's funny to be like, stop here, travelers. We will attack you. We're bandits. And they turn out to be lower level bandits, and they really bit a fight that was much harder than they could chew.
So when you're looking at the pacing of the encounter, one of the things is making sure that the players have access to the information that they need to move swiftly through the encounter. So one of the main ones for this is the initiative order in a place that people can clearly see it, and are people paying attention to what's going on in the fight. You know, if someone's spaced out and on their phone or whatever and isn't paying attention to the combat, and then you have to be like, hey, you know, Bob, it's your turn, or whatever, and then they're like, oh, what's going on, and then you have to go back and update them. That's going to take much longer than if Bob's paying attention and knows that it's about to be his turn. But you can also, like, help cue people in too, and say, you know, all right, it's Kyra's turn, Sione, you're on deck. Right. So that the person who's next knows that it's about to be their turn and can be thinking about, okay, now that I see what the battle state is here, what are the actions I'm going to want to take?
So, for more information on within a single encounter trying to work on the cadence of that encounter, running it efficiently, see our episode on running encounters efficiently. once it's up on YouTube.
Yes, that's right. So I thought I thought this is actually what you were.
This is what I'm talking about. We talked about in-game encounter pacing.
Mhm.
Out-of-game encounter pacing between encounters is something that is slightly different than we did in the how to pace your entire session, and slightly different in the how to run an encounter efficiently. This is more of a like, how do you time encounters in your session to
like when do you put them?
multiple encounters? Because just like we talked about in-game with multiple encounters, how much your characters can take, you need to understand out of game how much your players can take.
Yeah. So
there's a certain amount that can wear them down. If you just do encounters again and again and again, especially if they're hard, can psychologically wear them down. Look, I'm guilty of this sometimes too. There was like a big dungeon that I was running in Jade Regent that just had a lot of encounters. At one point, I psychologically wore Linda down with just the amount that the enemies were like soldiers, and they were always like setting up traps and having like a wall that they were behind, and she was just like, this was lots of fun, but we had to do like so much tactics over and over again. It's kind of like, I need a rest from this.
Yeah.
Because that was all that was in the AP, and that kind of indicates that you need to pace your encounters out of game. Even if there's nothing else in the AP that's in between the encounters, think about letting the PCs role play out a conversation as they're checking the room for treasure or something like that.
And if there's not, like, and if there really isn't a good in-game thing that they're doing, take a break out of game. Like, get a snack and chat with people and do other things like that to sort of take down the, like, tactical thing, or kind of talk with them about how things have been going and other life stuff.
That's right. You can do something completely out of game, even if there's nothing in game, that can still help break the tension up and then get them excited for the next one, rather than just making it feel like a slog, which it could potentially be if you don't. If there's an NPC that's in there that is like not an evil NPC they're killing, but just one that's along, you could have the NPC start a conversation with somebody, or have some weird interesting thing happen, or a feature of the dungeon that maybe wasn't in the published adventure normally that the players can interact with, that can give them a break from all that ratcheting tension.
And I want to address something in the chat here about following guidance of exploration roleplay combat in the Sandpoint Exploit campaign. They end up with many sessions with no combat exploration. Like, it's completely fine to have a session that's all roleplay if that's what your players are into. I find that then you can consider it on the larger arc, where maybe, you know, you have some heavy roleplay sessions and then you have some heavy combat sessions and things like that. It's all down to what your players like. Definitely in my Kingmaker campaign, we had completely combat-free sessions sometimes, but that's because players were exploring something that they were interested in. But usually you're going to have at least one player at the table who really enjoys the combat, so you want to mix things up and make sure that there's something for everybody.
So Nightbeer asked, what about reinforcements in encounters that happen right after the combat or even in the middle of the combat? That's okay, but consider that, and in fact, sometimes that's great, but consider that to be like one giant combat at that point. Like, for example, but I mentioned this in a recent episode about something else, but my group were playtesting the Advanced Player's Guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and we ran a converted version of Cradle of Night. And the group went in a back door to this one dungeon, encountered the boss immediately. Hey, we talk about doing the severe encounter first. After defeating him, they made it out into like a central room that was like connected to all the other rooms. And enemies started pouring out into the room based on, like, some of them, it said in the thing, were, like, sleeping or, like, need to put on their armor. And, like, every round, like, more people would come into that room. They eventually triggered what would have, theoretically, if it was all together, been, like, as much above extreme as extreme is above trivial encounter. But it was just one giant running fight, like maybe the fight in Daredevil that's in that one hallway, where all sorts of things just kept piling in. The group was dealing with it. They had a life oracle who was able to do the healing. They had people who were tanking and grappling, and witches with AoE attacks, and it was just, they had a lot of fun doing that. It was one big fight.
Yeah. So your difficulty there is going to be, you know, it's going to be higher than handling all of those encounters individually when they can rest, but it's definitely lower than just throwing all of the things together into one big pot. Particularly the longer that they have between the rounds that things come in. Because if you have like at least 3 rounds in between reinforcements, then they may well be able to clear through everything before the reinforcements come. Whereas reinforcements that come round after round after round, those are definitely going to be more difficult. And you can also choose how to pace it based on how much they've cleared out.
So Linda said it's definitely going to be harder than doing all of them completely separately, and that it's definitely easier than them all being together. It's definitely easier than them all being together. It actually could be easier than doing them all separately if you have exactly the most PC friendly cadence.
Oh yeah, where it's
that's like, right. Oh, you won.
Oh yeah, and you won. Now you have just enough time.
You won. You have like a round to do a little bit of healing, and now the other ones are coming in, because that that can potentially, if you have a 2-stage fight like that, you could potentially have minute length buffs, which are usually super fight chaining and incredibly powerful, that are already active when the second group comes in.
For 2 or 3, yeah, but when you do something more like that, where
it's when you have like 12 of them, obviously, even no matter what, if you have 12 encounters in a row, that even if you do the 1 round delay and then the next one comes in, the minute level ones are gonna run out.
It's just like what you're saying about like when are you gonna need to take your 10-minute rest, and if you can't take your 10-minute rest, then that.
Yes. So there's a question for you, Linda, as one of the
pacing Kingdom
one
turns
of the most experienced Kingmaker GMs at adding tons of ridiculous things. I'm sure there are not that many who've spent as many hours as you making a giant spreadsheet for everything possible in Kingmaker.
I'm not familiar with the Kingdom rules in 2nd edition, though, which they may be talking about for the Kingdom turns.
So even though the Kingdom and Army things work differently in 2nd edition, I think your experience with pacing them is still would be relatively accurate, right?
Yeah. So Kingdom turns is something that I found that some players were really excited about and some players found boring. So they are actually something that while I initially handled in sessions, I wound up handling more and more outside of session with the players who were excited about them. And then doing them based on the, generally looking at doing them around once per session, whenever they were available, because they were the way that we track time passing. But in order to put space between them, I looked also for making sure that every month there was at least something that happened. So I took I looked at like the calendar of Galarian holidays in Pathfinder Wiki, and I also had an expanded chart of random events that would happen, so that every month, in the beginning it was only 1 event that happened each month plus holidays, and then later on it was like 2 or sometimes even 3 events that would happen. Depending on the kingdom size, because it made sense once you had more folks, more things would happen. So it would be, you have an event where, there's a rash of thefts that are going on in this area. You have an event where like there's a strange meteorological convergence or whatever, and that's something that you deal with, so that even if you do still wind up having like multiple months pass over the course of the session, you're not going to have like that many months pass. It's not going to be more than 2 months, say. And then that means that you don't have to do as many Kingdom turns all at the same time.
Also, the events were kind of the thing that everyone came together for. So, the beginning of the session, I was one of the players who wanted to work on things. So the ones who wanted to work on them would come give a report to everybody about what we did, in case they had a problem, which they never did. And then Linda would say, oh, by the way, this thing happened. And then we would deal with what happened, and that worked well for pacing.
And then when we did have a player who wanted to like do more exploration of like how his character was interacting individually with various NPCs out in the world, and then we just did solo sessions for that. So
not recommended for many people, but it worked at that point.
It worked in that particular time because that was something that was like it was pure role play, and it was something that I knew like everybody else was going to get bored if it was just his character talking to random folks. Yes. So we paced it out based on what people were interested in, so people would just participate in what they wanted to.
Linda added so much content, including an entire map of that was like kind of in between the maps that were like diagonally adjacent to 2 of them, but was missing, and she just created a map and then added it. And if you want to see what that map kind of looks like, the Doomsday Dawn map kind of looks like the map that Linda added, because I used it as the baseline for like what's the difference between going south from No Man Heights before you hit Gulf.
Yeah, you kind of use the map as a baseline, and then the encounters wound up.
The encounters were different, but the map was similar. Because it was that section of the just southeast of Stolen Lands. But yeah, that style that Linda talked about there, like using randomized tables with events, is a great way to just, you don't even know what the pacing is going to be. I did something similar in Jade Regent. I thought that like the Arctic Crossing had too few things that happened overall, so I created a 54 events. And I assigned each of them to a Harrow card, and then we would draw a Harrow card.
You shuffle the deck and draw it, and then there's
Harrow
that visual.
cards, you know, because Koya was the Harrower for the group, and you know, it's like, we have the big sky in our future, and then whatever that was, that would be one of the events that they encountered, and so it made the journey feel longer because there were 54 random things that happened.
I mean, the more that happens, the more you're going to zoom in on it. Because if you wind up in a situation where you're just doing like subsystem rounds over and over again, it doesn't feel like it's as engaging. Just like, you know, you don't always want your journey from one place to another to be like, and then they arrived uneventfully. It's good to have something else that happens along the way. And I know we don't always do this in things like organized play adventures since space is at such a premium, but if you've got the space to do it, it's good to add in. I see a question here. If you did an adventure about Nex versus Gab or Chillax versus Andrew, would it make more sense pacing-wise for Kingdom Turn style, or just focus on your small party like Rebels or Vengeance? I really like what... why is this name falling out of my head? War for the Crown. I really like what War for the Crown did, where like the gameplay itself was very focused on the PCs, but you have like these maps where you see the progression of other things that are happening in the background, and then you can know that's the background that's informing things.
That's right.
I think that it really depends upon
what it did with the maps is every volume, it showed which of the claimants for the War for the Crown had gained what territories, and if someone had been subsumed in their colors and names. And you didn't run all of that stuff, but the players were involved. So like sections where the players had succeeded, their faction would suddenly be in charge of that section, or would have removed someone else from
So then you combine things that the players have direct agency over, but for something so as large scale as a war, you know, it doesn't make any sense for one group of 4 to 6 people to be able to shape everything. So this is what you had control over, and this is what... These are the other things that are going on, and this is what you're going to now choose. Which of these things am I going to react to?
That's right. So I think that I was also going to say War for the Crown does it pretty well, because you feel like you have a lot of influence overall on some of the most important things that are happening, but it does feel like a larger war that's like, it's not just you, more things are going on, and you don't have to run kind of mass combat that is, in some cases, like, I wouldn't say pointless, but it's like, it's hard to fail forward with mass combat. Usually if you lose mass combat, you lose in a lot of cases, and it's not the main game. So if it's not balanced heavily in the player's favor, in which case, okay, you just ran something that was balanced heavily in the player's favor, and had to learn a giant subsystem, was there a huge point. But if it's not balanced heavily in their favor, then you might have a decent chance of just TPKing the entire campaign in this subsystem-y thing that is probably less balanced than the main game.
Yeah, and there's also a situation where, because it's not using the main game, players might be like, well, my character could have done this my character could have cast Fireball on that group, like, why can't I do that? So
yes. So it's very risky.
When you have those discrepancies, like, it kind of reminds me of, I really liked your caravan combat system that you came up with for Jade Regent, but there was also the fact that in that system, you know, you could take like permanent injuries that couldn't be healed by like just healing magic. It's like, oh yeah, you know, you have like or long-term injuries, like, you know, you're missing a finger or something like that, or you have like this long-term injury to your arm. And so we'd always joke about like, oh, you know, caravan combat, it's so deadly. Like, it doesn't matter if you're gonna go out and get like chopped by the Grim Reaper scythe. It's more dangerous as caravan
Grendel
combat.
Can rip off an arm.
Okay, but there's not that many creatures who can. So like when there are those discrepancies between the rules, you know, it really just can create that sense of like, wait, this isn't how it
became a thing with our group. So that then like in Iron Fang Invasion, there's like an NPC who is like missing a leg, and but she turned out to have like been like a caravan guard or something. Before that, I was like, we knew it. We knew
caravan
it was
combat.
That's just sort of in the in the Ludo narrative space of like mixing the mechanics and the narrative, where
Mhm.
somehow the mechanics of the game don't allow for things that probably would happen in the narrative, like scars and
things
other
like
stuff
that.
like that.
So, but the mechanics of that subsystem did, and so therefore it was like, oh, caravan combat.
Although almost nobody ever got any of those.
Yeah, that's true. It
But
just allowed for it. So.
it was possible if it happened if you didn't have certain characters retreat, which you were allowed to have them retreat.
Mm-hmm.
And protect them, but that it was possible that it could have happened in any given caravan combat. It was very unlikely. It would have required a 1 in 9 chance, even given that you drew something twice, which required the fight to have gone on for a very long time, and that the PCs didn't do anything about it.
Yeah, it wasn't like it was likely. It was just that it was possible.
Yes. And most fights didn't necessarily go on long enough for the card to be drawn twice, because it would have had to be drawn in the negative future position, and the same card then be drawn again in the negative future position rather than in the neutral or positive position.
Yes.
Yep. So that is what we're saying about the pacing of those subsystems.
Yeah.
So we've talked about in-game pacing, out-of-game pacing for encounters, and some subsystem questions that were in chat. I don't see any more questions in chat, so this seems like a pretty decent time to say bye to YouTube and go into our outro. So, bye YouTube.
Bye.
See you next time, YouTube.